Let's get to it. Why don't you take your Bibles and turn them to the book of Revelation, chapter 2. Revelation 2. Before we read, just let me set the context. Kyle kind of did that. But just so we understand what's going on here, the Apostle John, he's about 80 years old at this point. He's imprisoned for his faith on the island of Patmos. And there, as Kyle just mentioned, Jesus, the risen Christ, appears to him, and he dictates 7 letters that are then to be sent to the 7 churches on the mainland of what is now modern-day Turkey. And so let me just quickly show you a map. You can get some bearings here. So here we are, of course, Rome and Italy over here. We got a blown-up section. Here's the little island of Patmos. Here is what we now call modern-day Turkey, and you have the 7 churches. They're kind of in a circular route. Last week we did Ephesus here. This week we are going to do Smyrna. So why don't you stand with me, and let's see what Jesus had to say to this church in Smyrna. I'm going to read Revelation chapter 2, verses 8 to 11. Hear now the word of God. To the angel of the church in Smyrna write, these are the words of him who is the first and the last, who died and came to life again. I know your afflictions and your poverty, yet you are rich. I know the slander of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Do not be afraid of what you're about to suffer. I tell you, the devil will put some of you in prison to test you, and you will suffer persecution for 10 days. Be faithful, even to the point of death, and I will give you the crown of life. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. He who overcomes will not be hurt at all by the second death. This is the word of the Lord. You may be seated. The ancient city of Smyrna is located in modern-day Turkey. It is actually now called Izmir. In 2001, the National Security Council of Turkey began to deem Christians to be a national security threat to the nation of Turkey, on par with Al-Qaeda. The reason, however, of course, was that Christians were leading people, and particularly young people, to become Christians, and this was the basis of the threat. And so things began to escalate as media propaganda, political leaders and columnists began to write against Christians and to slander them and to kind of build up a momentum to try to drive Christians out of the country. Pastor Nekati Aden was also from Izmir, from the ancient city of Smyrna, now Izmir. On Wednesday, April 18th, so just a day ago, a couple years ago, April 18th, 2007, Pastor Nekati kissed his wife and children goodbye, and he headed off to the office for work. He and 2 of his other Christian brothers were going to lead a Bible study for some young men who were interested in Christianity. It was a bit of a secret Bible study because of the political situation, but they were going despite the pressure that they were facing. On the other side of town, 10 young Muslim men were beginning their preparations for the Bible study. Now, later on, in further years, they would tell the court that what they did, they had to act because Christians were ruining their country. And so these young 10 men armed themselves with guns and with bread knives. All this service is built up in me with ropes and with towels because they knew there would be a lot of blood. Pastor Nekati began the Bible study by reading a chapter from the Bible, and when he was done, that's when the assault began. And the men, the attackers, filmed everything on their cell phones. As for 3 hours, they brutally tortured these 3 men and then slit their throats. In response, the church in Smyrna, the church in Izmir, wrote an open letter to the global church. They called it A Letter to the Global Church from the Protestant Church of Smyrna. I've included it in your bulletin for you. It's a very long letter. Please don't read it now. You'll be tempted to, I know. And I know when pastors say that, everyone just keeps reading anyway, so I guess if you're going to do it, you're going to do it. You can read it later. It's a very long letter, but let me read you a section that describes Pastor Nakati's funeral. So despite the risk to their lives, here's the quote, "Hundreds of Turkish Christians and workers came to show their love for Christ and their honor for this man chosen to die for Christ. Boldly, the believers took their stand at Nakati's funeral, facing the risks of being seen publicly and likewise becoming targets. As expected, the anti-terror police attended and videotaped everyone attending the funeral for their future use. The service took place outside at Buka Baptist Church, and he was buried in a small Christian graveyard in the outskirts of Izmir." Now, how do these Christians get such courage? Courage to do Bible studies when you know there's a threat to your life. They knew there was potential. It was a secret Bible study. Where do these believers get such courage to show up to a funeral that could result in your funeral? I think we need to know the answer to this question because although we face very minimal persecution, especially compared to these people, we have troubles just being sometimes known as a Christian. We feel a little embarrassed at times just to speak for Jesus. We often will hide the fact that we're Christians just so that we don't face any unnecessary criticism or people look down on us. So where did they get this courage? We're going to see that these modern Christians in Smyrna, thanks buddy, these modern Christians in Smyrna got their courage the same way that these ancient Christians in Smyrna got their courage. And they got it by listening to what the Spirit had to say to the churches. They had ears to hear what the Spirit of Christ had to say to the churches. And through our passage today, what Jesus wants to do in our midst is to strengthen us. To strengthen us to have courage to stand when the pressure for being a Christian begins to mount. So to do this, I think Jesus does at least three things. First of all, he's going to talk about how we are called into suffering. Secondly, how when we are in suffering, we face a temptation, and the temptation is to be cowards. It's cowardice that is the temptation. And then third, how we can have courage in suffering. So first then, let's talk about how we are called into suffering. Called into suffering. If you're going to get the kind of courage that the people in this story have and that Christians have had throughout history, you got to begin just at the simple level of expectations. Expectations are everything in all parts of life. I mean, if you are shown into a room, and let's say this room is kind of moderately furnished, nothing special, and then someone tells you, hey, this is a honeymoon suite, you're going to say, oh, I don't want to be in here. I can't handle living in this kind of space, especially on my honeymoon. It's terrible. You get depressed about it. But if you walk into that room and someone says, this will be your jail cell, you're going to say, that's not so bad, actually. I mean, there's a couch here. There's a nice queen-size bed. Expectations are everything. And in the exact same way, the expectations that you have for being a Christian will dictate a lot of how you deal with pressure and with suffering. If you, for instance, believe that becoming a Christian, if you become a Christian, Jesus will solve all of your troubles, that He will take away all of your sicknesses, and He will make you wealthy and rich, then when suffering comes, you will fall apart. You will not be able to handle it. But if you expect that becoming a Christian means that you're going to follow Jesus, and to follow Jesus means that you will often get treated like Jesus, then when suffering comes, you're going to have a different attitude. You're not going to enjoy it, but you will sit there and go, I haven't been crucified yet, so things really aren't all that bad. Expectations are everything. So what should the Christian expect? I've already alluded to it. Jesus' words to the church in Smyrna here teach us that anyone who wants to live for Jesus, should expect opposition. Anyone who wants to live for Jesus should expect opposition. You can see this clearly. Let's look at the letter. The Smyrna Christians were facing suffering for their faith. Look at verse 9. Jesus says to them, I know your afflictions. The word afflictions, it refers to pressure, to crushing pressure. The imagery in the ancient world would be of a boulder rolling over a person. In verse 10, Jesus says that this pressure is actually going to get more intense. Look at verse 10. Do not be afraid of what you're about to suffer. I tell you, the devil will put some of you in prison to test you, and you will suffer persecution for 10 days. Now, we'll look at that verse a little more in detail later because it raises some questions. But right now, I just simply want to show you that when Jesus writes to this suffering church, he doesn't write, a condolence letter. He doesn't, for instance, say to them, I feel really bad about what's going on with you guys, but I can't really do anything about it. He doesn't write to them and say, I'm going to stop your suffering. My people will never suffer. That's not what he writes. In fact, he writes to them to say, the suffering you're already experiencing, it's going to increase. You're going to be put in prison. Do not be afraid of what you're about to suffer. So then the obvious question is, what are these Christians doing wrong that this is happening to them? The answer is nothing. In fact, in these 7 letters, Jesus tells all the other churches what they're doing wrong. He rebukes the other churches except for Smyrna and Philadelphia, the only 2 of the 7 who receive no rebuke. There's nothing going wrong. In other words, these Christians here are not like the Christians in Ephesus, who we saw last week had forsaken their first love. They're not like the Laodiceans who have become lukewarm. They are not like the church in Pergamum and Thyatira that have compromised on the truth or have allowed immorality in their churches. No, these Smyrnan believers love Jesus. They believe the truth and they are full of love. They are commended by Christ, and yet they are suffering for their faith. What we're going to see is that when Christians give their full allegiance to Jesus, when you don't forsake your first love, when you really live for Him, that's when the opposition starts. And the reason for this is obvious. Although Jesus' values will often mesh with the world, no one's opposed to love your neighbor and that kind of thing, that goes well. But there are values, there are beliefs that the Christian has because of Christ that, depending on the culture, depending on the time, will clash. This is exactly what was happening in Smyrna. You remember, if you know just even a little bit of your history, that the Roman Empire ruled the world at this time, the Western world at this time. Smyrna was fiercely loyal to Rome. In fact, it was considered to be, aside from Rome itself, the first city of Rome. And the proof is very obvious historically. In 195 BC, they built a temple to Dea Roma, who is the goddess of Rome. That shows that you're in support of Rome. They were the very first city in the whole empire to do this. In AD 23, they built a temple to Augustus Caesar. In AD 25, they competed for the right to build a temple to Tiberius Caesar. And then they won the right, and not only did they build a temple to Tiberius, they also built a temple to his wife, and they built a temple to the Roman Senate. In other words, this city was absolutely loyal to Rome. This loyalty, if you even know a little bit of your history, you know that the number one easy way and expected way that a citizen showed their loyalty to Rome was to worship the emperor as God. This came along, and it's exactly at the time when these letters are being written to the churches. So Roman law required that every single citizen, whether upper class, whether lower class, come before the temple to offer a pinch of incense on the altar. And all you had to do was take a little pinch of incense, put it on the altar, and recite a very brief creed. All you had to say was, Caesar is Lord. That's all you had to do. Everyone just thought this is the easiest thing. It's really no big deal. What a simple thing to do. It was almost impossible to be part of the city's public life if you didn't do this. To refuse to do this would just be viewed as the height of, I want to say unpatriotism. I don't even think that's a word. But you would be viewed as unpatriotic. You would be viewed as being against Smyrna and against Rome. Why would you not do this? I can't even think of an analogy in our culture. I mean, it'd be like saying I refuse to sing the national anthem, but it's way higher than that. You know, I'm not in favor of anything to do in this city. People then, you would be barred from the trade guilds, so you couldn't be involved in any trades. You would be barred from all public official offices, so if you're a public school teacher, you would not be allowed to do that. You would not be allowed to hold any position of office, any government type of role. You couldn't hold any of these things, and then people wouldn't want to do business with you either because you are a traitor. You're not for our country. You're not for our land and for our city. Now, the one group in the Roman Empire that was exempt from this were the Jews. It was always a bit of a tenuous thing whether that exemption would continue, but they were exempt, and as long as Christians were viewed as being a subset of Judaism, Christians were okay. But if you read the book of Acts, you see that many Christians begin to be Gentiles, and they become Christians. There's conflict with the synagogues as they kick Paul out, and so there begins to be this divide, and then Christianity begins to be viewed as one of the illegal religions. And then also, what we can tell in reading through this text is that there were many Jews in the city of Smyrna who were then slandering the Christians. And you can just kind of imagine what probably happened. You know, we're having troubles with them, so we tell the Roman authorities, look, they're not with us. Don't think of them as Jews. They are something else. They are part of that new illegal religion. And so then the Christians were facing persecution because of this. So this probably explains this seemingly anti-Semitic comment in verse 9. Look at it with me, where he says, I know the slander of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. It's not anti-Semitic, first of all, because, I mean, just think about this. Who wrote this letter? Do you know? I just said it at the beginning. Who wrote this? It's John. What ethnicity was John? He was a Jew. This letter came through John, but it actually came from Jesus. Jesus was of what ethnicity? He was Jewish. This is not an anti-Semitic comment. It shouldn't be taken that way. It's simply saying that it's a kind of a theological statement. Those who say they are the people of God, they're not really the people of God because they are denying God by their actions. They would call themselves the synagogue of Yahweh. Well, this is no longer the synagogue of Yahweh because Jesus is saying by persecuting my people, they are following another spirit. So the Christians were facing persecution in Smyrna from the Roman authorities and from the large Jewish contingent that lived in the city. Because Christians would just simply say this: we believe, as the Scriptures teach, that we are to submit ourselves to the governing authorities. And Christians were well known for their obedience, for their paying of taxes and that kind of thing. But the Christians did say the one thing that we cannot do, publicly or privately, is give worship to a man as we would give to God. And so they refused to recite Caesar is Lord, for they believed, as was announced at the birth of Jesus, Jesus is Lord. There can only be one Lord. For this, the Christians faced suffering on at least 4 levels in our text. First of all, notice they were impoverished. Look at verse 9. I know your afflictions and your poverty. This is a material poverty. Since they were shut out of the trade guilds, since people would not do business with them, they found it very hard to earn a living. Secondly, they faced slander. Look at the second half of verse 12. I know the slander. You know, on the playground, what do we used to say? You know, sticks and stones will break my bones, but names will never hurt me. It never really was true, was it? That's like that's the thing you say because you're actually really hurt. It does hurt to be slandered. It hurts when people make untrue and unjust comments, when they ruin your reputation, when they talk behind your back. And the early Christians were radically misrepresented. There are some great letters that you can read from history of conversations between Romans and Christians and kind of the perception, especially later on, the perception that people had of Christians. And it was all slander. So, for instance, a lot of people thought Christians practiced cannibalism. You think, what? It's because Christians had this meal together where they said they ate the body and blood of the Lord. They said Christians practiced incest. Because they call each other brother and sister, they greet each other with a holy kiss, and they say that they're devoted in love to one another. They were accused of being atheists. When you think that, what? Atheists? Well, you got to understand the whole world were gods, and the Christians were saying none of those gods are real. We don't think any of those are real, and so they were considered atheists and therefore a threat to the public order. So all that was, it was slander. But what can you do when people just put out caricaturizations of you? You try to combat them, but it gets into culture, it gets in, and people just like, what's with you people and your incest? That's just weird. Third, they were imprisoned. Look at verse 10. I tell you, the devil will put some of you in prison to test you. Finally, notice in verse 10, they were put to death. They're about to be anyways. Be faithful even to the point of death, and I'll give you the crown of life. Sounds like what happened in Kenya a few weeks ago when 150 Christians were gunned down. Sounds like what happened in Syria a few months ago when 121 Christians were beheaded. I mean, do you see how this all works? If you want to live for Christ, it means following Him and His values. And these values, they're going to inevitably, at some point, they're going to clash with culture. And Jesus is really saying in those moments, Christians, you got to understand, you're going to lose most of the time on that. But you'll notice that Jesus does not say to the Smyrna Christians, I'm going to take away your suffering. He doesn't promise them, if you just follow me, I will give you all the mansions in this world. I mean, this health and wealth prosperity gospel that is on so many TV preachers, it doesn't come from the Christ of Revelation. It doesn't come from the Jesus of history. To be a Christian means to walk in the steps of your master. That's why Philippians 1:29 probably puts it best. It has been granted to you on behalf of Christ, not only to believe on Him. That's been granted to you. What a gift. But Paul says it's not only been granted for you to believe on Him, but also to suffer for Him. You hear that? It's been granted to you on behalf of Christ, not only to believe on Him, but also to suffer for Him. Now, we don't face anything like the suffering of the early church. Nothing like what's gone on in Turkey in the last few years. But we do know a little bit about what it means to have that pressure coming in on us. Our culture is gradually, maybe sometimes too fast, turning to applying more and more pressure. Some of you know this in your families. To be a Christian in your family is a very difficult thing. We often will know in our culture, you can talk about spirituality all day long, but if you start talking about Jesus, that changes the conversation. I mean, you can believe whatever you want. Just don't say Jesus is the only way, or you will get in trouble. You will get labeled. You will be narrow. You will be bigoted. How could you possibly believe that? Think of the pressure facing Trinity Western University right now. That's pressure coming down upon them and really the whole Christian evangelical community in the Lower Mainland in Canada. These 7 letters are meant to show us the issues that every generation of Christians faces. And last week we saw there's a temptation for Christians. Here's an issue you'll face: to forsake your first love. That's the first temptation. If you don't follow that one, what's going to happen? If you do love Christ, you will face pressure for serving Him and loving Him. Now, let's just be clear. This doesn't mean that the Christian life is not filled with joy and hope. It's not to disparage any of those kind of things, but it is to say you better get your expectations right. Here's how Jesus Himself said it. If the world hates you, keep in mind that it hated me first. If you belong to the world, it would love you as its own. As it is, you do not belong to the world, but I have chosen you out of the world. That is why the world hates you. Remember the words I spoke to you. No servant is greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they will persecute you also. I have told you this so that when the time comes, you will remember that I warned you. So this is the hard reality. Doesn't this go right against so much of the... ever watch television preachers? Please don't. There's very few good ones. There are a few good ones. But the message that goes out so often is, come to Jesus. He'll make you rich. He will solve all your problems and heal all your sicknesses. Friends, Only in America, only in Canada, only in the Western First Nation worlds can you preach that kind of a message. They try to do it in Africa too, but people are then deceived into it. But try going to Africa and let's see how many of your sicknesses have been healed. Jesus isn't promising that. Does he heal sick people? Yes, he does. But does becoming a Christian mean that he's going to make you rich and let you live out your life on a bed of ease? No, Jesus is saying the opposite. You've been granted to believe on me, and I am also going to call you to suffer for me. We live in a bit of a bubble historically. This is not normal for Christians to be treated so well. It may even think it cracks me up to think of this, but when my dad was a pastor, on Mondays, which was typically a pastor's day off, if he took 3 guys along with him to the golf course, he got free golf because he was the pastor in the town. He's the only one. No one else got free golf. But a pastor was respected in the community. And people went to church because that's what people did. That was important. What a shift has happened, right? Now, I don't want to be a doomsday person here and just say, we're going down and it's going to turn into we're all going to jail. Who knows, it may, but God might bring revival as well. So we don't want to be doomsday. But, this trend is certainly going a bit more towards the pressure side, isn't it? And Jesus says you've got to expect it. That's normal. That's the normal Christian life. And if you don't get it, you should view it as abnormal. For as Paul writes, we are all like sheep taken to the slaughter. Expect suffering is what he's saying. Now, having talked about that, let's then move on to talk about the next thing, which is when we are in suffering, there is a unique temptation that we face. When the pressure increases, there's a temptation that every believer will face, and that is the temptation to cowardice. So let's now talk about cowardice in suffering. When the Christian, or when the pressure for being a Christian increases, fear tempts us to turn away from Christ in order to alleviate that pressure, right? Now let's just be really honest. It works. If you're facing pressure for being a Christian, the easiest thing you can do if you want to get rid of the pressure is simply to downplay Christianity, to hide your love for Christ, or ultimately, if you deny him, it'll go even better. It'll take off all the pressure. But this is cowardice. The Smyrna Christians, however, were not cowards. Remember, there's no rebuke here, but what we do see is that Jesus says, you're going to face a temptation. And that temptation will be fear, and the fear will try to lead you into cowardice to deny Christ. So look at it, it's very clear in verse 10. Do not be afraid of what you're about to suffer. The suffering is coming. Jesus wants to prepare them. And in Jesus' mind, the most important thing they need to hear because of the temptation they will face is not to be afraid. So fear, then, is the temptation that leads to cowardice. It's also clear if you look at verse 10. Look at the end of verse 10. This is the positive side. Be faithful even to the point of death. So that's the opposite of faithlessness. Be faithful. Or look at the end of verse 11. He who overcomes will not be hurt at all by the second death. We are to be, positively speaking, overcome the pressure. So negatively, that would be to give up, to be crushed by the pressure. We are to overcome it. So fear is the unique temptation that comes when the pressure gets turned up, when it gets stronger, and that fear is what leads to faithlessness. I mean, the best example of this would be Peter. There he is on the night when Jesus is betrayed, and he follows Jesus, and the pressure just begins to crush in on him as he knows, if I confess Christ, I could be killed too. The pressure, and he denies Christ 3 times. All because the pressure increased, the temptation for fear came. He knew, if I deny Christ, I can alleviate the pressure, and he was right. He did. But to his own shame, for he went and wept bitterly. This all sounds great, that we're supposed to be faithful and to be overcomers. But in real life, this can be so hard, can't it? It's not fun to be looked down on. Nobody likes that. It does not feel good when people misunderstand you and then misrepresent you and call you homophobic or bigoted or transphobic or something like that. And despite what you say and you're labeled that way, it's not fun. It's hard when you're in a university setting and people look down on you when they find out you're a Christian. Well, how could you possibly believe that? No intellectual person with an 8th grade education would believe in those kind of things. There's a scorning and there's a looking down the nose at. And nobody likes to be disrespected like that kind of a thing. It's hard. So the pressure, again, it begins to come in on us. And when the pressure comes, the temptation is to back off, to hide your Christianity, maybe even to deny it. So then the question becomes, how do we get the courage to follow Christ when the pressure becomes crushing? That's the final thing. We come now finally to talk about courage in suffering. The simple answer is this: look to Jesus. Now, I know that sounds cliche. You're just sitting there going, okay. And this is something that always, for me as a Christian, has always bothered me when people give cliche pat answers. When you're going through something hard and somebody says, just trust God. And I'm like, yeah, just trust God. What does that mean? Help me with this. What does it mean to trust God in this moment? Don't give me these cliche answers. So I don't want to give you a cliche answer. Here's the big answer. Look to Jesus. Now let's see. In our text, what we see is, what does that look like? Why should we look to Jesus? And this text is just got threads woven right through it the whole way, where Jesus is trying to get the Smyrna church to look to Him to receive the courage that they need to endure under their suffering. So let's do that too, okay? So here's a bunch of points. First of all, look to Jesus when the pressure to be a Christian increases, because Jesus is eternal. He's eternal. Look with me at the way he begins the letter. Right from his salutation, he starts introducing himself in a way that should inject courage into their hearts. How does he begin? These are the words of him who is the first and the last. Remember, Smyrna called itself the first city in Asia. It was proud of being first. It had the first, because it had the first word, it should therefore have the last word. And because it was so loyal to Rome and such a great city. Jesus here uses an imagery of first and last. These words are a direct echo from the Old Testament, for this is how God Himself refers to Himself, especially through Isaiah. Isaiah 48:12 says this: I am He. I am the first, and I am the last. In other words, what hope then, what courage we should get when we are afraid? Because our lives are not ultimately bracketed by what people think of us, where our culture's at, what our city would say to us. That's not the brackets on either side of our life. There is one who is before that first bracket. He is the first. And there's one who is the last. He is after all things. In other words, Jesus has the last word. He has the last words on your life. Therefore, His opinion is what ultimately matters. He's the eternal God. Already, this just begins to put a little shift. It begins to put a little courage into us. And then it just keeps going. Second of all, look to Jesus when the pressure to be a Christian increases, because Jesus is victorious. He's victorious over death. So look at the salutation again in verse 8. These are the words of Him who is the first and the last, who died and came to life again. It is the resurrection of Jesus that should fill them and should fill us with such courage. For, listen, if He rose from the dead and He will raise all of His people who love Him from the dead, what can touch you? The ultimate worst thing that people could do to you would be to kill you. That's the ultimate weapon. But if death itself cannot ultimately kill you, if Christ will raise you like He was raised and raised Himself, then nothing can ultimately kill you, right? You are therefore invincible. Look down at the end of verse 11. It's the same type of thing. He who overcomes will not be hurt at all by the second death. That's the death that we should fear. So first death, physical death. Second death, the judgment of God and what the Bible calls hell. This is saying, if Jesus is your Savior, death's not going to hurt you because Christ is the one who died and came to life, and the second death is not going to hurt you. In other words, your future is secured by Him who is the first and the last, who died and rose again. You are invincible. Nothing can ultimately then take you. Rodney Stark, he wrote a book called The Triumph of Christianity. I highly recommend it to you. It is a little thick, but it is an easy read. The subtitle is something like How the Jesus Movement Became the Dominant Religion of the Roman Empire, something to that effect. And what it traces is kind of the historical causes for why or how Christianity would begin with just Jesus and his 12 buddies in the backwater of the Roman Empire to taking over the entire Roman Empire where 50% of the people are believers, the emperor himself is a Christian. It's a historical phenomenon. And one of the major factors that Stark gives for the rise of Christianity is the witness of the martyrs. Here's what he writes. How could mere mortals remain defiant after being skinned and covered in salt? Oof, that's a rough one. How could anyone keep the faith while being slowly roasted on a spit? Many pagans were amazed. The distinguished physician Galen wrote of Christians that, quote, their contempt of death is obvious to us every day. Because Christians were being killed, and the way they died made people sit up and go, what is with these people and how they die? It's astounding. He goes on, accounts of martyrdom make frequent mention of pagans having gained respect for the faith, from having observed or even taken part in the torture of martyrs. The pagan onlookers knew full well that they would not endure such tribulations for their religion. Why should so many Christians do so? Were they missing something about this strange new faith? This sort of unease and wonderment often paved the way for new conversions. Because listen, if Jesus rose from the dead, if he will raise us as well, then nothing can ultimately defeat us. What is slander if one day the risen, reigning King of the universe will give you an applause and say, well done? I mean, what is poverty if you are rich in Christ? And this is what Jesus says, you're poverty and yet you are rich. What is death? For death, if someone kills you, and this is what the early believers would say, if you kill me, you just give me what I ultimately want, and that is to be with Christ. So when the resurrection goes deep down into your heart, it creates a courage that is absolutely invincible, and it's been testified to by all the martyrs of history. That's courage. Third, look to Jesus when the pressure to be a Christian increases because Jesus is all-knowing. Look at verse 9 with me. This is such a tender phrase. The risen Christ says to these Smyrna believers, I know your afflictions and your poverty. You know, when we're scared, especially when we're kids, we want to go to our parents' room, you had a nightmare or something. You want your parent, they will know what's going on. They will be able to comfort you. Because they're your parents, they know and they know how to comfort you. And this text is saying to us, and if you read back at the end of verse 1 or chapter 1, Jesus is walking among the lampstands which represent his churches. In other words, he is present with his people. And because he is present with us, he knows. So for you today, he knows the pressure that you face. Such a tenderness to that, isn't there? Finally, or fourth, we got 5. Fourth, look to Jesus when the pressure to become a Christian increases because he's sovereign. No pressure or suffering can come to you as a believer unless Jesus, the sovereign King, permits it. So look at verse 10. It's very clear here. Do not be afraid of what you're about to suffer. Why not? I tell you, the devil will put some of you in prison to test you, and you will suffer persecution for 10 days. In other words, the devil's going to use, it's not just the Romans and the Jews that are persecuting the believers. There's a dark power behind it as well who's using all of this to persecute Christ's people. But clearly here, it's Jesus who's in control. He is the one in chapter 1 who is the reigning king. He is the one who's saying, this is what the future will be. He's announcing it. It's not like he's saying, I wish it couldn't happen that way, and I'm really sorry, but I can't do anything about it. And it's very clear when you look at this little phrase, 10 days. It's probably not a literal 10 days. In this kind of literature, these kind of numbers usually have significance, and the number 10 usually points to a short but limited period of time. In other words, if it's literal 10 days, then it's very clear. Jesus is saying, the devil may do this. The Romans may put you into prison, but I am the sovereign one over it all. And I decree that you will only suffer for this limited time. It's like, remember when Satan came to God and he wanted to make Job suffer. God permitted it, but he put boundaries. You may go this far in what your actions are, but no further. Never forget this, that the devil is a dog on a leash. And the sovereign Christ will pull him and he will yank him back whenever he pleases, for he has absolute authority. The universe is not a yin and a yang. It is not a black dog and a white dog fighting for control. It's a king and a mad dog, and that dog one day will be put down. Until he's put down, he is pulled wherever the king allows him. He lets his leash go and then he pulls it back. And that's what it's saying here. But don't mistake it. It's Jesus who's sovereign. So when believers are suffering, when you're under pressure, it's, all right, Jesus knows it, and he's sovereign over it. Now finally, look to Jesus when the pressure to be a Christian increases, because he's generous. This letter, like all the letters, ends with a great promise. Look at verse 10. Be faithful even to the point of death, and I will give you the crown of life. To the Ephesians, it was to eat of the tree of life. It's all really the same thing. But in Smyrna, this would have made more sense to them. They had an arena. They had games. They'd watched, the Greco-Roman wrestling. And what Jesus is saying to these believers is, look, just like an athlete is in there wrestling and suffering, and they're struggling with all their might, and the pressure is upon them, just as that athlete goes through that, and when they are done, they are crowned with a wreath, that is our version of a gold medal. So also Jesus is saying, when your suffering is done, I will crown you. I will put the medal around your neck. I will give you the tree of life. I will give you the commendation of well done, good and faithful servant. And you will be the victor, the overcomer. Now, I began by telling you a story about Pastor Nakati, this modern-day Smyrnan martyr. But there is a martyr from Smyrna who is far more famous than Pastor Nakati. In fact, he was most likely in the church when this letter came to Smyrna. He was most likely there when it was read for the first time. If that's not the case, he was most certainly there later on, for John himself appointed this man to be the pastor of the church. So here's Bible Jeopardy for all the marbles. And if you're from Regent, you can't answer. Do you know who that martyr is? The famous bishop from Smyrna. Some of our lead people got to know this. I mean, you can't pass lead until you know this. His name is Polycarp. In AD 168, Polycarp was an 86-year-old man. He was captured, he was imprisoned, and then he was brought into the amphitheater to the thunderous applause of the crowd who had come to witness his execution. The proconsul, though, had compassion on him, an 86-year-old man. And so he simply said, and we have the record of that, basically the transcript of it for so many people being there. He said this, Polycarp, deny Christ and swear that the emperor is God. Polycarp said, I have now served my Lord Jesus 86 years, and he has done me no harm. How can I deny my king who has saved my soul? The proconsul threatened, I have wild beasts ready who will tear your body limb from limb if you do not curse Christ. Let them come, for my purpose will not be changed. The proconsul answered, if the wild beasts do not scare you, I will have you burnt in the fire. You threaten me with a fire which will burn for an hour and then will go out. But you are ignorant of the fire of the future judgment of God reserved for the everlasting torment of the ungodly. But why do you delay? Bring on the beasts, or the fire, or whatever you choose. You shall not move me to deny Christ, my King, Lord, and Savior. And with that, Polycarp took off his robe and laid himself down on the pile of wood for the fire. It was lit on fire. He was terribly burned, but a wind came so that the fire could not continue, and so they ran him through with a sword. Friends, when you face pressure for being a Christian, we must not fear in this. Do not compromise and let the fear lead you to cowardice. Because we have Christ. We have Christ, the eternal one. Christ, the sovereign one, the victorious one, the all-knowing one. He is the one who walks among the lampstands of his churches. He is present. He knows, and he says to you, be faithful to me, and I will give you the crown of life. You see, all through these letters, it's point, counterpoint. You can deny him, but if you deny him, you'll get hurt by the second death. Be faithful to him, you won't get hurt by the second death. Die for him, you get life. It's always point, counterpoint all the time. And Jesus is saying, I will give you all of this. I will sustain you. So in your pressure, in the pressure you face, fight the good fight. Be faithful. Look to Christ. Let's pray.